Yeah, there's always a fine balance between sort of doing too little of things that sort of frightens you and scares you, or just your amygdala doing whatever it wants, and doing stuff that's sort of too bad, so to speak, for example, your reputation or whatever. And I think it's, and by the way, I also think that most, I would say all people have some part of their prefrontal cortex trying to justify why I'm not doing this because I'm afraid, I'm doing it because X, Y, Z. Or just not even being close to consider that might be the case, that it's just the amygdala, the fear center of your brain, doing stuff with your mind that's not in your interest, especially in the modern world, where it's, yeah. And so the general discussion of just trying to be odd or doing be yourself or whatever is, it's quite hard, because there's a lot of stuff, things people are doing, in my judgment, that's not in their best interest, but it's an expression of themselves. And you could say that of anyone who is doing something, expressing themselves. And it's, I mean, you only judge as much as you have to, but when it comes to sort of violating traditional ways of doing things, because some things have stood the test of times because it's good, and some things should be challenged, and that's a very hard discussion and decisions to navigate, especially in the modern world where things are going so fast, and at least I would say cultural wise, and I've always been sort of skeptical when people say, well, you should sort of challenge, or you should, in order to train yourself to expose you to fears and doing stuff that develops your ability to get over fear. I've always been skeptical of doing things, especially in public, that's when you know people watches you, sort of, that's bad for your sort of reputation. But the only instance when it's not in sort of private is probably when it comes to identity. Like, for example, I would not, even if I would be hesitant to put on female clothes, like really like robes or stuff, even if I'm in private, because it would not feel like too far from my how I identify myself, or even want to perceive myself. But there would all be other crazy stuff that I would do in private for myself that I would not be ashamed of. That might be even more crazy, but so I guess it comes to identity there. But otherwise, I don't think it should be overused in like public sort of settings where because you're actually gambling sort of with your reputation and your how you're perceived and stuff. But it is still a good tool to challenge yourself in general about, especially if you're doing something that you think is good. Like, for example, I don't care anymore, or I don't care anymore. I don't think I've ever cared that much since I started. That's probably why I started. If someone perceives this as weird, just posting videos, because no one is even watching, but I'm doing it mostly for myself because it's a good habit to share your knowledge and insight to the degree that you're insightful. But I still think I have something to contribute, and so that's something that I find that's a good example of doing stuff that's not comfortable, perhaps odd to some, but still. And by the way, I also think that, going back to if you associate it with sort of, well, let me put it this way. There are many reasons for why you would say, for example, that it's not, well, especially in Sweden, where you have the sort of the jantelag, as it's called, where it's a bit odd to try to think that you are someone, especially when you start posting stuff online. Someone might watch a little skeptical and think, what are we actually doing there? Is that normal? Have you not written under the consensus that we should hold on so dearly to as an how should I put it, as an collective? But in general, I think on some metrics Sweden is considered very individualistic anyway, so it's hard to sort of categorize a society, but yeah, I think it's true to a quite strong degree that posting stuff of yourself, just talking or pictures or whatever, I would say it's worse with picture, but because it's so focused on your looks, or perhaps it's as bad with talking. But no, I don't think it's bad in general, but what I'm trying to say is that yes, narcissistic traits is probably correlated with sort of posting of yourself online, but it's definitely not a guarantee for that someone is, that would be very backwards to say. As with lots of things, like for example, if someone, well, it's just the discussion of correlation and causation, or like for example IQ and grades in school, that's also a good example. It's correlated, but it's not to say that the higher the grades, the higher the IQ for every individual person. Like when, by the way, everyone has, speaking of sort of narcissistic traits and Machiavellian traits and psychopathic traits, the dark triad, everyone have elements of them, all these traits. It's just about how much you have them, basically speaking. I mean, we're on a scale on all those traits. And so, and why I brought it up is because I think it's dangerous if you get over into because there will always be some critique of someone doing something, even if it's not heard. Like for example, for me, I'm not the public person, so I don't hear that much of critique, but that's something. It's always, if someone watches, it's always going to be some skeptical mind about what's doing and finding a reason for, well, that's bad, well, that's just narcissistic, or that's yeah, whatever it might be. And that's a part of being a human, and the best way as to think about it, as I usually come back to in all these old videos that I've posted, not all on X but on YouTube, is always try just to understand the world in terms of academic knowledge, especially from hard sciences, which includes biology. Basically, it's the most foundational. It's just since the connection to chemistry and the DNA, so it's quite solid, if not to say extremely solid. But that we're developed in an environment where if people in the group thought you would be too odd, you could actually be excluded in the group, and then you would die. So that's why many social fears in this world exists, and usually the fears that holds people back the most, and usually most constructive to challenge. But then comes the question, it's not about just challenging for the challenge's sake, it's about challenging things that you question about. It's not about, not even about sort of questioning things, it's more like what's the most appropriate way to handle life here and now, and then just, what's it called in English? Föregående gott exempel. What's that in English? To just try to do, if no one else is doing it, you could do it yourself, basically, even so that people say, oh, that's a better way of doing it, and daring to do that. And that's quite hard, and I don't claim to be an expert on it. And on some things I think I'm good at it, on other level, on other things, I think I'm really bad at it. So it really depends on what sphere of social bravery, what's it called? Bravery, yeah. So, yeah, I think that's it.